There is a population living along the Aegean coast of Turkey whose ancestors were brought there in chains, who built a distinct culture that survived more than a century of pressure to disappear, and whose DNA has never been sequenced by a single published study anywhere in the world, not one. In an era when geneticists have mapped the ancestry of Amazon rainforest communities numbering in the low thousands, of Caribbean island populations, of small farming villages in the Andes, the Afro-Turks of Izmir, Aydin, and Mulla remain, genetically speaking, an open question nobody has bothered to ask. To understand how strange that silence is, you have to understand who these people are and how they got here. Beginning in the 14th century and accelerating through the 18th and 19th, the Ottoman Empire brought enslaved Africans into Anatolia through the same trade networks that fed the broader Arab and Ottoman slave systems. Men, women, and children taken primarily from East Africa moved through Zanzibar and the historic Zanj coast, along with others brought from Sudan under Ottoman-controlled Egypt, and from as far as Niger, Libya, and the Arabian Peninsula. Many were put to work in agriculture on the fertile plains of the Aegean, in the Dalaman, Menderes, and Gediz river valleys, and around Manavgat and Chukurova. 19th century Izmir had entire quarters associated with its African population: Sabertasha, Dolapkuyu, Tamashaluk, Ikicheshmilik, Balakuyu, names that appear in contemporary records but rarely in the history most Turks learn in school. A smaller, later wave arrived indirectly. Africans who had been enslaved on Ottoman Crete were swept into the 1923 population exchange between Greece and Turkey, arriving in towns like Ayvalık speaking Greek, the only language they knew, and learning Turkish only after they landed on Anatolian soil. With the founding of the Turkish Republic in 1923, formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants were granted full citizenship, a real and significant legal transformation on paper. But citizenship came bundled with an unspoken expectation: assimilate completely into a unified national identity that had no conceptual space reserved for a distinct African-descended minority. Names were Turkified. Communities dispersed into agricultural labor across the Aegean countryside. Cultural practices, including a traditional spring celebration called Dana Bayrama, the calf festival, quietened into near extinction by the 1960s, kept alive in fragments by an aging generation with no organized way to pass it forward. For most of the 20th century, Afro-Turks existed in Turkey the way a fact exists that nobody is actively denying and nobody is actively stating, either technically known, practically invisible. This is where you'd expect the science to eventually arrive, the way it has for nearly every other African-descended population this channel has covered. Geneticists sequence the Garifuna of Central America down to specific haplogroup frequencies. They map the Noir Marron of Suriname's rainforest interior with enough precision to detect a 3-century-old population bottleneck. They traced Afro-Mexican ancestry to the level of specific immune system gene selection. Population genetics, as a field, has shown itself remarkably capable of finding small, historically obscured African-descended communities almost anywhere on Earth and giving them a number, a percentage, a haplogroup, a place in the scientific record. So here is the disturbing question this particular population raises. And it isn't about what the data shows. It's about why there is no data at all. A search through the major genetics databases and peer-reviewed literature turns up extensive population studies on Turkish genetic ancestry, broadly research mapping Central Asian, Anatolian, Caucasian, and Mediterranean contributions to the modern Turkish gene pool in exhaustive detail, some studies sequencing whole genomes from thousands of individuals. Not one of these major studies isolates or specifically analyzes an Afro-Turk sample. Not one published mitochondrial or Y chromosome study exists, mapping this community's specific African origins the way similar studies exist for Afro-Bolivians in an isolated Andean valley, or Afro-Venezuelans in a single small town, or Noir Marron communities with populations smaller than many Turkish villages. The silence isn't a gap in a well-studied field. It is close to total. This absence is not simply an accident of academic funding priorities, though that plays a role. It reflects the same historical mechanism that quieted Dana Bayrama into near extinction, a national identity project that, for most of the Republic's history, treated ethnic uniformity as a foundational virtue rather than a demographic reality to be studied. Turkish nationalist historiography in the 20th century emphasized a cohesive, singular national narrative, and minority populations that complicated that picture, whether Kurdish, Armenian, Greek, or African descended, received limited institutional space to be researched, taught, or counted. Population geneticists studying Turkey inherited this framework by default. Grant proposals go where there's institutional interest and existing infrastructure. If a government census never counted Afro-Turks as a distinct category, if universities never established archives of oral history or biological samples from these communities, there is no infrastructure for a geneticist to build a study on top of, no established sample bank, no starting point. The absence in the historical record produced an absence in the scientific one. There's a second, quieter layer to this silence, and it comes from within the community itself. Estimates of the current Afro-Turk population range wildly, anywhere from 5,000 to as many as 100,000 people, a spread so wide it borders on meaningless, and that uncertainty is itself the clearest evidence of how little formal attention this population has received. For most of the 20th century, Afro-Turks had no organized association, no shared institutional identity through which researchers might even locate a sampling population. That changed only in 2006 when Mustafa Olpak, whose own grandfather had been taken from what is now Kenya to Ottoman Crete and enslaved there, founded the Afrikalalar Kultur ve Dayanışma Derneği, the Association for African Culture and Solidarity, initially based in Ayvalık before relocating to Izmir following an attack by nationalist extremists. Olpak's own family history, documented in his book chronicling his grandfather's life, became one of the only detailed written records connecting a living Afro-Turk family to its specific African origin point. He died in 2016, before genetic science had any organized community structure to study. Since Olpak's association formed, small cultural gains have followed. Dana Bayrama has been revived, celebrated for over a decade now by a younger generation reconnecting with a tradition their grandparents' generation nearly lost. When Barack Obama visited Turkey in 2009, Afro-Turk representatives used the moment to draw rare national attention to their community's existence. In June 2020, following the murder of George Floyd in the United States, the Afro-Turk Association organized demonstrations in Izmir, joining a global wave of visibility for African-descended communities that, for a brief moment, put Turkey's own black minority into domestic headlines it had almost never occupied. None of this, notably, produced a genetics grant, a university research partnership, or a published ancestry study. Visibility in the press did not translate into visibility in the scientific literature. What makes this genuinely strange, rather than simply sad, is the contrast with how thoroughly modern population genetics has treated Turkey as a subject in every other respect. Turkey sits at one of the most extensively sampled genetic crossroads on Earth, precisely because its location between Europe, the Caucasus, the Levant, and Central Asia makes it scientifically irresistible to researchers studying ancient migration, Neolithic farming expansion, and the genetic history of West Eurasia. Thousands of Turkish genomes have been sequenced and cross-referenced against Greek, Armenian, Caucasian, and Central Asian reference populations in extraordinary detail. The scientific appetite for understanding Turkish genetic history is enormous. It simply has never, in any published study currently available, turned its attention specifically toward the descendants of the Ottoman Empire's own African slave trade, a population living in the same country, sampled by the same universities, studying the same broader Turkish gene pool, and somehow never isolated as a subject in its own right. It's worth comparing this directly to what happened when researchers finally turned their attention to other small, historically obscured African-descended populations elsewhere in the world, because the contrast makes the Afro-Turk silence even harder to explain away as simple happenstance. When geneticists sequenced the two known Afro-Bolivian genomes from the isolated Yungas valleys, a community numbering only in the low thousands, They were able to trace the ancestry to specific West Central African source populations and date the admixture event to within a few decades of historical accuracy, cross-referencing more than 50 African reference populations in the process. When researchers studied the Noir Maroon of French Guiana, a population that spent 3 centuries deliberately isolated in dense rainforest, they still managed to publish genome-wide analyses detailed enough to detect population bottlenecks and selection signatures down to specific chromosomal regions. Both of those communities are harder to physically reach, harder to sample, and by most measures more logistically difficult to study than a population living in Turkey's third-largest city and its surrounding provinces, connected by paved roads, universities, and hospitals capable of running the exact same sequencing technology used everywhere else in the world. Difficulty of access was never the barrier here. Something else decided that this particular history wasn't worth looking at closely enough to fund. For Afro-Turk individuals today, many of whom, like Mustafa Opak's own family, know only fragments of their specific ancestral origin, a country, sometimes just a region, rarely a specific community or lineage, this absence carries a particular weight. A Garifuna elder in Belize can, today, look at a genetic report and see a percentage tied to Sierra Leone or the Senegambia. An Afro-Mexican fisherman in Costa Chica can, in principle, access a study connecting his community's genome to a specific selection signal shaped by 4 centuries of Mexican history. An Afro-Turk grandmother in a village outside Izmir, by contrast, has access to oral family history if she is fortunate enough to have inherited it, and nothing else. No haplogroup, no percentage, no study to point to. Her history exists almost entirely in memory, in the fragments of Dana Bayrama her grandparents still practiced, in the Turkified name that replaced whatever name her ancestors carried before enslavement, and in absolutely nothing that modern science has yet chosen to verify. This is, in its own way, the most honest twist this channel has encountered so far. Every previous story here has ended with data confirming, complicating, or rewriting an origin story that oral tradition had already been telling for generations. This one cannot end that way, because the data doesn't exist yet to confirm or complicate anything. What we're left with instead is something more uncomfortable and, in its own way, more revealing. A population whose erasure was so effective that it extended even into the discipline built specifically to recover erased histories. The genome of every Afro-Turk alive today still carries whatever specific West or East African lineage their ancestors carried across the Mediterranean centuries ago. That information exists, encoded and waiting, exactly the way it existed in Suriname's rainforest interior or Belize's coastal towns before anyone thought to look. The difference here is simply that nobody, so far, has looked. There is a lesson in that gap worth sitting with, one different from anything this series has said before. Sometimes the most revealing thing science can tell us isn't a percentage or a haplogroup. Sometimes it's the shape of its own silence, which communities got studied first, which got funding, which got a place in the archive, and which were left standing at the edge of the historical record with nothing but memory to carry their story forward. The Afro-Turks of the Aegean coast are still waiting for the moment their DNA finally gets asked the question every other population in this series has already answered. Until that day comes, their history belongs entirely to the people who lived it, passed down through festivals nearly lost and names quietly changed, waiting for a science that has, so far, simply never turned to look.